Hello, this is Gonzalo Lira speaking to you live, and this is the Roundtable number 42. I'm joined by Glenn Diesen and Jean-Francois Gariepy, and you can see that I'm in my little terrace and fully lit. I don't look like the Prince of Darkness as I usually do because I bought a light. I don't know if you can see it in the reflection of my glasses. It's that
Oh
round
yeah,
light.
circular.
Yeah, because I want to get that really, I want to look really glamorous. I want everybody to think I'm really, really hot. Glenn, JF, control yourselves. Trying to, I know that this, is too much for you guys to handle, but we're going to have a lovely conversation with these two gentlemen. I'm very much looking forward to it. Let me introduce first Jean-Francois. Jean-Francois is an old friend of mine. He is a neuroscientist and he is a YouTuber, content creator. I've known him for 5 years now. And Jean-Francois, it's a pleasure to have you on. Thank you so much for joining me.
Great pleasure. Always to see you again. It's so great, and it's so great to see how your career has popped out on this geopolitical commentary. I'm just so proud of being a friend of yours.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I so appreciate it. And Glenn Diesen. Glenn Diesen is a professor of political science at Norway's Southeastern University. Am I getting that right? Yes.
That's correct.
Glenn is a person who's been getting involved in the geopolitical commentariat on YouTube. He's been on the Duran. He is like a big brain, and so JF and I are going to be like the sidekicks because he's the big brain, and we're going to be discussing all kinds of very interesting things. Just before this show started, Glenn was telling us, and it was such a good story that I asked him to stop because I want him to tell the audience his story. That Glenn, you've been the recipient of a 7-page hit piece calling for your removal from your university, and I'm going to tell you, I've had 2 hit pieces like that on the Daily Beast and on the Bulwark. So you got to work more. You got to, one piece, 7 pages. Come on. Please tell us about that piece in particular, and what did they allege you were? That you were being paid by Putin or something, I imagine?
Oh well, the paid by Putin is the common one. Well, we were discussing now the problem of any freedom of speech at the moment, I guess, but for journalists, podcasters, but also for academics, they're rolling back the academic freedoms to a large extent. So, well, it began first with a few newspapers writing these hit pieces, and there's always this common theme that they ask, they interview the headmaster of the university, asking, is it problematic that you have a Russian propagandist on your payroll? They never, and then, after trying to shame for a while to get you fired or canceled or censored, they have to up the ante a bit. So yeah, the last piece was fascinating. I thought it was funny, but it wasn't meant to be. It was, they put me the whole front page plus 7 full pages. And the main argument was that I was in breach of international law, and this could create legal problems for the university if they keep my employment here. Now, it was interesting because...
Wait, before I continue, the breach of international law, that was just what you were saying. You were just saying, giving analysis. Well, or did you do it? Did you run guns or something to Russia, or something?
No, it wasn't about my weapon smuggling or anything else. The main problem was, they said, the argument was that spreading war propaganda is against international law. However, I'd said pretty much from the first day I had been again opposed to war. I mean, I was opposed in 2014 when Yanukovych was toppled by Western governments, and I didn't support it also when Russia invaded. So I said, well, and they recognized this. So what is war propaganda if you haven't actually supported the war? And they said, well, I speak to Russian media. The Russian media support the war, and they do propaganda, they say. So hence, I am responsible for spreading war propaganda. So I am in breach of international law, and I should pretty much be banned from the country. This is.
We're talking about your birth country, I take it.
Oh yes, my birth country. Well, no, not actually banned from the country, but I should, I shouldn't be allowed to work for the university. This is, they try to make a legal issue out of this, but of course it is nonsense. You can't be accused of spreading war propaganda if you haven't actually supported anything. And furthermore, like this is an interesting rule because you see this across Europe now as well. This idea that if you support a war, now you should lose your job, you should be fired. I mean, I don't remember any of this when we bombed Yugoslavia or Iraq, Libya, Yemen, Syria. This was never a rule. I remember when I was a student, when the Americans invaded Iraq, we had some people arguing for the war, others against, and it was able to have an open debate. These days, you have the acceptable side, the ones who oppose it, and the rest who get fired. But there's another more nefarious element as well, which is people like myself who try to argue what is happening, like what is the background of this conflict, because I would like to explain, because in the West, like all we have now is this one hypothesis. Why did Russia invade in February? Well, it's either they want to restore the Soviet Union, Putin woke up one day and really wanted some new territory, or it's just being a very, very evil. But so if you want to present an alternative hypothesis saying that they were provoked, or by NATO expansion, which has been substantiated by many American leaders, ambassadors, foreign ministers, defense ministers, CIA directors. If you suggest this, well, now if you're trying to explain why Russia did what they did, now they're saying, well, if you're explaining it, you're legitimizing it, aren't you? So now you have to lose your job as well. So it's very hard. And the interesting part is there's maybe a grain of truth there. If you try to explain why something has happened, then then you're trying to explain their motivation. You can always be accused of legitimizing something. So this is kind of the propaganda shtick they use against you, which is anyone who tries to explain the background of something, they can be said that they legitimize it, and it's illegal now apparently to legitimize wars. So then you're tossed out. So it's a very absurd situation, because we're in the middle of this huge war. It's escalating. It can quickly escalate into nuclear war. And yet no media, no one is allowed to even discuss how this began. What is the background? No one discusses it. No one wants to talk about how we got into this or how we can get out. So it's for an academic, it's impossible to have any debates.
I don't understand this notion that you can't legitimize something. I mean, how is it explaining the motives of somebody like bad? I mean, the use of the word legitimize is weaponized. JF, I mean, correct me if I'm wrong.
Yeah, it's a fascinating word that stems from leftist pursuits of cancel culture. When the regime goes at you, they use these double standards always. I'm sure Coach Red Pill knows a couple of examples, but I think the best way to compare this story is to go back to the history of war in America in the 90s and the 2000s, and this whole pursuit in the Middle East, and you realize by the standard that they applied to Glenn, how many American journalists would have been seen as violating international law? How many American journalists stood beside George Bush, stood beside the warmongers across all of the wars, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria strikes? They don't apply this standard. They only apply it when it's an enemy of the regime who comes with IDs that they don't like. And that's why they need terms such as justifying or misinformation. They are looking for a tool that will allow them to attach you to something you didn't do.
Yeah, and the thing I find bizarre is, questioning somebody's motivations is always a healthy thing, because then you're able to understand why they are doing whatever it is that they're doing. And you can also see when sometimes the reasons that they claim to be doing something truly are illegitimate. For instance, in the 2003 war, it was the weapons of mass destruction. But you start digging into that even at that time, and you realize this is so much balderdash, to use polite language. There are no weapons of mass destruction, and yet they are claiming that this is the reason for it. And so digging into the motivations, actually, and to the reasons. I mean, legitimizing somebody's reasons is an invitation to examine those reasons and see if they are true or not. And insofar as the 2003 war, the West's war, the Americans' war on Iraq, was completely illegitimate. I mean, Saddam Hussein had nothing to do with 9/11, and certainly wasn't producing weapons of mass destruction. And yet here, in the Ukraine conflict, the Russians, whatsoever you might think of Putin himself, the Kremlin leadership, or the nation of Russia, they clearly had very good reasons to go into this, including actual weapons of mass destruction with regards to the biological weapons facilities that they have come across, and which Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary of State for Political Affairs in the United States State Department, admitted in congressional testimony that they had these bioweapons labs in Ukraine. And so, you want to understand what somebody else is doing, if only to see if there is a way out of the situation, or to determine, no, there's no way out of the situation, we have to go in full-on conflict. And so it's this weird desire to be ignorant. It seems that in the West, we have this notion that it is better to be ignorant and be the white hats, and just ignore what our opponents are doing or why they're doing it, so that we can gallop forth on our white horse in our shiny armor and inflict horrifying damage on whoever opposes us. I mean, Glenn, do you think that this is basically it? That it's like a Manichaean moral vision of the world: black hats, white hats?
Oh, definitely. This is what happens often in conflicts. Everything has to be simplified into good versus evil, and you always have to have the narrative. You have the victim, you have the perpetrator, and then you have the savior. And again, that's been my main criticism. Is I don't think NATO has played the role as the savior here. I would like to explore the extent to which NATO has contributed to this, to provoke this conflict. But again, it's something you're not allowed to discuss. And for me, it's very absurd, because if you're arguing, listen, if NATO, like Russia's main motivation is it's concerned about this encirclement by NATO. So from this argument, I would argue that if NATO offered security guarantees to Russia, which they've asked for 30 years, so primarily stop expanding towards their borders, then Russia would be willing to give huge concessions to Ukraine. Now, wouldn't this be a pro-Ukrainian argument? But you can't make that. They say, well, no, that's anti-Ukrainian. The pro-Ukrainian thing is actually to fight to the last Ukrainian. And for me, this is absurd. Okay, you can argue this. I have an opposing argument. Let's have the discussion then. But there is no discussion. It's just, this is the only thing you're allowed to say, and other people should be censored. And I think you're correct, Gonzalo. Like, this is, bad arguments should be drawn out in the light. If I or someone else would have an argument, bring it forth. And again, this was a key argument by Bertrand Russell. I remember in the 1930s, he wrote that the best way to fight propaganda is to have an open debate. Have like Stalin and Churchill have a debate. This is the best. This is how you avoid propaganda: is bring forth the argument. But instead, we have this absurd notion that, oh no, everything Russia says is propaganda, and the way to fight propaganda is full censorship. I mean, that's why we're here today. We have, during the Soviet days, the Cold War, we knew what the Moscow's argument was. Not anymore. We censored all their channels. We're censoring our own journalists. We are forcing academics to do self-censorship. So we don't know what their argument is anymore. And it's just extreme. And I think we're doing ourselves a huge disservice as well, because it's a benefit of having an open society where we can debate. This was built over generations. We're standing on the shoulders of past generations, and we're just tearing it all down. And this is supposed to be the patriotic thing. It's just it's very frustrating to observe.
It goes against everything that liberal democracy is supposed to stand for. I mean, the whole notion of liberal democracy depends on free speech. If you don't have free speech, a true ability to say whatever's on your mind, however ridiculous it might be, well, it adds to the conversation. And if you say something completely absurd that is not supported by the facts, then in an open society, it's easy to show the counter arguments and dismiss the factually inaccurate or ridiculous statement, which is a good thing, but they don't want that. JF, I want to ask you, because we were talking before the show about Arrestovich. You've been following that little shit show?
Yes, and I think it's a perfect illustration of how the deep state is getting tired. And all these pro-Ukrainians are faced with an amount of ideological resistance on the internet, which will expand, I think, given the liberalization of Twitter and free speech coming back. And I think that they're getting so tired that they're starting to commit errors here. Arrestovich basically recognizing that, okay, it was a missile that perhaps was sent by Ukraine, an errant missile, and not a targeted attack on a residential building by Russia, which wouldn't make sense. And I found this beautiful, how he ended up resigning. I'd like to hear Glenn about this. What is happening currently with the Arrestovich situation?
Oh, quick parenthesis. Because Arrestovich is germane because he was the chief propagandist of the Zelensky regime, and he resigned today. Please, Glenn.
Yeah, but it wasn't only this. Of course, this was very problematic. That he pointed to actual videos where they had shown that Ukraine, well, what appears to have been a Ukrainian missile shooting down the Russian one and then ending up on an apartment building. But of course, this went against the narrative that the Russians are, targeting civilian buildings, which, well, again, it wouldn't make much sense given that to some extent this is a war over hearts and minds. But I thought, but then he had another interview now, which I just watched today, which I found to be fascinating, where he effectively accused Zelensky of alienating the Russian speakers and the ethnic Russians, because he was saying, listen, what are we doing? We're the idiots here because we are, we were telling them all Russians are evil, they're bad. And then he said, well, why would they support us? They would secretly sit there and they would resent us. They would either want to go to Russia or they want Russia to come to them. And this is something that many Ukrainian soldiers have complained about on Telegram as well, that, the local population are actually giving their coordinates. They don't want to leave. They're waiting for the Russians. So, but Arrestovich kind of made this point, like, instead of just calling them evil, let's look towards to what extent we have caused this. If you keep calling anything Russian ethnic, Russian speaker as evil, then why would they want to be with you? This was Arrestovich's argument. And he also, fascinatingly, he said Zelensky had waged war on Christianity by, well, having these campaigns against the Ukrainian and the Russian Orthodox Church. It's not, it's just the fact that this was Zelensky's advisor going out. And again, this very, well, how would you otherwise call it then an attack on Zelensky? And then, of course, he resigned. So I'm not sure what he's doing. Is he going for a presidential bid here? Is he setting himself up as a rival to Zelensky? It's unclear, but something has cracked apparently.
Yeah, and JF, what do you think is Arrestovich's game plan?
Well, I think he's just a rational being in an irrational situation. And these systems that try to impose a discourse against the truth, they end up having all sorts of cognitive dissonance. And I would say that Arrestovich is the incarnation of that cognitive dissonance, where you have a bunch of people like Zelensky who don't care about the truth, don't care about what actually happens and what is the set of incentives that he's responding to right now. Because Zelensky is stuck in a set of incentives where, as Glenn pointed out, he wants to fight to the last Ukrainian. And that's all he can do, because that's the only way he can guarantee the flow of money coming from America, the support and the rise of his own elevation as a kind of leader that brought Ukraine closer to Europe and closer to America. There is no situation in which Zelensky has an interest in peace. And I think that when Arrestovich makes discourses publicly that seem to show a different mentality, seems to engage with the truth, of course he gets rejected by the system.
Well, I think that Arrestovich, quite frankly, and to put it very simply and bluntly, I think he's a very clever rat who knows when his ship is sinking. I do believe that this man has marked himself for death, because I don't know where he is located at this time. I mean, I don't know in what country he's in. If he's still in Kiev, then he's a marked man. I think that it was, I think, foolhardy of him, actually, to have said this publicly in a situation where he can potentially fall under threat. I suspect, and of course I can never prove this unless we had him right here and he had like a truth serum, but I suspect that he deliberately created the conditions where he would have to resign, because I think that he, and this is pure speculation on my part, but I think that he realizes that the game is up with the fall of Soledar and the imminent fall of Bakhmut. And on an operational level, the fall of Bakhmut will be a catastrophe for the Zelensky regime. It really will be, the knocking on the door of the last door of this conflict. And so I think that he deliberately did this so that he could get out. And I mean, Glenn, help me out here. Do you think I'm just full of shit, or do you think that there might be something there?
No, I'm not certain. Well, certainly something is cracking at the moment. I think on the battlefield, you see, there's been some of the battlefield losses appears to have happened because there is some cracks in the military. There's a lot of military groups who have refused to take orders. Often it's because, well, as they explain on video, they don't have enough equipment, enough weapons, and they don't have the intelligence. They don't get the information updates, and their commanders abandon them. So they said we would just leave, and then a flank opens up, and Russia does this huge moves to encircle them. So I think so something is happening within the military is being weakened. I think the economy is also it's not on the brink. I think Ukraine would have been bankrupt long ago if it's not bankrolled by the West. I mean, even the US and the EU recognizes this, and so I think it makes sense that there might be some political rifts as well. I always assume that if there would be a challenge to Zelensky, it might come from Zaluzhny, for example, from the military, simply because I don't see a civilian like Arrestovich being able to challenge Zelensky. I mean, they banned most of the opposition. They arrested the opposition leader. They banned the media. They're going after alternative sources of loyalty, such as the churches, and so this is a very hard crackdown. I can't imagine Arrestovich being invited to a very open democratic debate, an election where where we're in a scenario where Arrestovich could be elected. So I'm not sure what it's going for. So if that's not a possibility, are they looking for a post Zelensky era? Again, I don't want to go too far because this will be just wild speculation. But of course, when one of the key most popular figures in Ukraine, the advisor of the president, suddenly goes like this on TV.
I do have to say, I don't think he's the most popular or among the most popular. He's the most visible, but I don't think that anybody trusts him. Because he's certainly high in visibility, but so far as trustworthiness, I mean, the guy's creepy as hell. I mean, just looking at him and listening to him talk for 5 minutes, and you're like creeped out. But I'm sorry, Glenn, I interrupted your flow.
No, I'm just saying once the military begins to crack, the economy begins to crack, then you see the political aspect cracking as well, and the possible future successors might start to pop out. I just assumed it would be General Zaluzhny and not Arrestovich. But again, it might not be that Arrestovich even tries to do a presidential bid. I think he would, but again, it might not be. Maybe it's just, like you said, seeing a sinking ship and running off. Again, I don't know his motivation, so I can only speculate. I just find it amazing that this has actually happened.
But you would agree with me that his faux pas yesterday of saying that the missile was because of anti-air defense systems, and that it wasn't deliberately, the apartment block was not deliberately struck by the Russians. Would you agree with me that was a deliberate provocation to create the conditions where he could resign? Because it seems so to me, to tell you the truth.
Well, it definitely could be. I mean, and I would say that because the reaction by the government and all of Twitter sphere, it was all quite predictable. You can't have an apartment building destroyed and then everyone consolidates around the argument or the narrative that Russia targeted a civilian apartment building on purpose, and then suddenly you come out and say, no, actually it was us. We shot down a missile. So oopsie. You can't go out and say that and assume there won't be any backlash. So he must have. He's a very smart man, though. Like a lot of his analysis are quite good. There's a lot of the premise of his analysis I would disagree with, but still, he must have foreseen this problem. So, but again, maybe he's seeing a Ukrainian population who's becoming a bit wary of, the stranglehold by Zelensky and all the lies that, especially now with the fall of Solidarity, they were told they were just marching forward, chasing out the Russians, and now a lot of people are beginning to challenge, maybe question whether or not where the government's lying. If they're looking for a voice of truth, maybe he saw an opportunity and wanted to position himself there. But I would agree that I think he must have foreseen that this was gonna have a huge backlash. Whether what he said is correct or not, that's not the point. It's you can't go against the government and essentially be seen to, taking, if you say this is the truth and but it happens to, make an excuse for Russia and essentially blame the Ukrainian missile defense. It has to have a consequence. That's my point.
Yeah, that's why I think that he's too sophisticated to have let that slip without having thought it through and had a plan. And JF, you're a crafty guy. Would you agree?
Well, I'm a crafty guy, but not in the domain of intentions. I rarely attribute intentions. I think those are two very interesting sets of speculation. The idea that he would have done it intentionally and the idea that he could even become president. But those are speculation, but very interesting. I think it's totally possible. And I don't see how you would do this in a context where you're surrounded by werewolves, basically people of war, people who are fully you're either with us or against us. And in that kind of context, a man who's somewhat intelligent should know that this will be the consequence, that he's going to have to run.
Yeah, that's just to hammer that point in as well. I just want to say I agree with that, because my own point is, yes, he must have known this was a consequence. What the intention was of this, again, wild speculation on my part. I'm just saying he must have known.
I'm still here, just getting coffee. I'm sorry, you were saying, Glenn?
No, I was just making the same point as JF here, going that this is my point is simply must have known this would have a huge backlash if he went forward and said this. But to what the intentions of this, that I wouldn't know. Again, then it's just wild speculations. And
now they're talking about sending tanks to Ukraine, which is absurd, because for those of you who don't know, to gear up a tank crew takes 6 months to a year. It's not a simple thing, because the people think that tanks are like cars. They are most certainly not. They're very sophisticated pieces of equipment that require a great deal of training, especially to operate effectively in a militarily effective way. And so they're talking about sending all these tanks. And when you start adding up the numbers, they're basically talking about sending roughly 50 tanks from NATO countries, all of them different tanks, Leopard 2s. They're even talking about M1 Abrams tanks and so forth. And see, all of these tanks require different maintenance, different training. And on top of that, altogether, they're talking about roughly 50 tanks. Whereas the Zelensky regime at the start of this conflict had a couple of thousand, I believe. And they've been destroyed. I mean, that's why they require tanks now. And so it's sort of like, what is the West doing? I mean, JF, what are your thoughts as to the West's policymakers?
The West is doing what it's always doing. It's trying to maintain face in a war of attrition that they probably can't win. And I would do parallels even in the way the left has lost on free speech with Elon Musk buying Twitter, the way the left has lost on medical authoritarianism and that kind of stuff, where the discourse is constantly reverting against them. And I think that the way they are sending, they would want to send tanks is just to make a moral display, to say, oh, we were there, we supported you. But it's just the looks, because I don't think it's particularly a tank war. I don't think that tanks will give a massive advantage on the Ukrainian side. If anything, they will be a burden, and they will be easy targets also. So I just don't see the military point here. It's a much more strategic war with movable units, air, drones, airstrikes. I don't see what 50 tanks will do here.
Yeah. JF, what's the mood in the West? Because we've been on this thing for coming up on 11 months of this conflict. What's the mood so far as you see it? Because you're in Canada. And the Union of Soviet Socialist Canadians or whatnot. But tell me how things are in Canada and how you see it from the perspective of the West, this conflict.
The mood hasn't changed, but the face has changed. Because at the beginning of this conflict, I was talking to farmers in my area, because I live in a distant place in northern Canada, and they would take me aside and say, "JF, have you seen this war coverage about Ukraine?" And they would basically whisper to my ear, "You know what? I'm not that much for Ukraine." And so this has always been a background of resistance. I don't know that people have been enthusiastically joining the side of Ukraine. What we had is bots on the internet puppets of the regime, just talking pro-Ukraine talking points, and a completely biased internet that was favoring this discourse. So the face of this discourse is changing, but the background is always the same. I don't know that the average American, the average Canadian cares about Ukraine and thinks that this is the fight for our civilization to extend toward the East. I think people are annoyed by this kind of expansionism and imperialism. They've went through the whole Middle East thing. It didn't work. It didn't lead to any sort of benefit other than for the military industrial complex. So that's the feeling. It's still the same. It's the same feeling that persists through a war of attrition that our leaders are losing progressively.
Yeah, I mean, like I look at it and I ask myself, at what point does the West say enough? And what I find deeply troubling, and the reason I'm so concerned is because I don't think that the West has any kind of reverse gear, and they have an inability to just cut their losses and say, okay, this didn't work out, let's move on. And so my great fear, is that they will start using actual NATO troops, because they are using NATO troops because all these pieces of gear that they have sent so far, the M777s, the HIMARS, they're all operated by Western military contractors who probably, most of them, 5 minutes before, were members of NATO armies, and they resigned their commission and signed the private military contract, company contract, and came to Ukraine to use these weapons, to operate these weapons. But I wonder if there is a definitive loss, a clear and unambiguous failure at Bakhmut, which seems inevitable at this point. And because the Zelensky regime, at NATO's urging, has invested so many lives and equipment into the Bakhmut battle, because at this point it is the largest battle, it eclipses Mariupol. I wonder if they're going to say, okay, let's go in with troops on the ground. And Poland has been making a lot of noises about, essentially wanting to join this thing. You had President Duda, who was in Lviv last week, as a matter of fact, and he was greeted like a rock star, and this notion that Poland might join into this fight and ally itself to Ukraine and fight the Ruskies, I think is insane, because then you're opening up a can of worms that you cannot, it's toothpaste that once you squirt it out, you can't put it back in the tube. And so my fear is that as NATO goes in with real, actual NATO troops on the ground, uniformed NATO, and they lose, because they will, because they don't have enough men, they don't have enough gear, and logistically, it's a nightmare insofar as crossing all of Ukraine, from the west to the east to fight the Russians, that they're going to get annihilated, and this will precipitate some sort of crisis whereby the West might come to the conclusion that, oh yeah, let's use a little tactical nuclear weapon to even the playing ground, just one, just to try it, just a little, just to see how it feels. You see what I'm saying, Glenn?
Yeah. No, it's well, I think a key problem we have in the West now is, the public support was, like all wars we've entered in the Middle East. It's supposed to be easy in and out, and then we're supposed to fix everything. Again, remember the sanctions were going to, destroy the Russian economy before the weekend, and militarily, the Ukrainians, we keep saying they're winning and they're winning, but I think these lies are becoming a bit more obvious, because we at the same time we keep saying, well, we need to turn the tide. We need a huge game changer. We need more weapons. These are not things you say when you're winning. This is what you're looking to turn the tide, and looking for game changers when you're losing. And I think again, it's not an attack on the Ukrainian soldiers. They have fought bravely and well, but you can't defeat Russia. This is the power is is much more powerful, and so I think that a lot of the Western public were maybe lured in by, first of all, removing all context, that this was just, unprovoked. Russia did not have any serious security concerns it was reacting to. And once we started to support, Ukraine with all these weapons and intelligence, training, then we just kept saying, oh, no, they're winning. We just have to give them the tools to win. This was the argument. But I think now that the Ukrainians are weakening more and more, if we want to keep this going, we're going to have to send in a NATO army. So Polish, Romanian, Americans. But again, it's a possibility, but it would be very, very unpopular. Even again, I think the Polish among all the Europeans would be the most ready to go to fight Russia. But that's the government. If you look among the Polish population, it would be very hard to get a democratic majority support. I'm not saying they need a democratic majority support, but there's very few now who's eager to join in on this, because this is a war of attrition, and the destruction now is just horrific.
Yeah. No, but also there's something else too. I mean, I think that we can all agree that the current regimes of the West, and we call it the regime singular, because it does seem to be this cosmopolitan leadership class that is in control of the Western mechanisms of power, they do not care, not one iota, for the will of the people. They sort of like throw sops to the people and a lot of propaganda, but they don't actually care about what the people are up to or the grievances of the people, or much less their opinion about something like this particular conflict. So I think that the regime will, in desperation perhaps, put boots on the ground, and that's my fear. My thinking at this time is that what the regime plans to do is basically use Poland as the next proxy, the next battering ram against Russia. JF, I see you nodding there. You agree?
Yeah, that would be worrying to me, because as you were mentioning earlier, basically the nuclear outcome of the current world isn't fully in the hands of America. I am convinced that Putin will not initiate a nuclear strike just for winning a war or winning quicker. Ultimately, it depends on America whether we will have a nuclear war, and that is a scary prospect given past American military decisions.
But we actually began. Sorry.
No, please, Glenn.
Well, we began talking about Arrestovich, and I thought that was interesting because he predicted that the Americans would get involved. I mean, a lot of the West knows Arrestovich best probably from this interview he did for Military Review, this TV program on TV in 2019. Like, what was interesting with this interview, he predicted the war because, well, the whole premise is because, we have NATO and the EU, and Russia's not part of the new Europe after Cold War. The problem for the countries between NATO and Russia is we have a divided Europe. We kept Europe divided, so you have to choose East or West. So his perspective was we will gradually be absorbed back into a Russian sphere within the next 12 to 15 years, or 10 to 12, something along those lines. So he argued the only way we can sever ourselves of the Russians is by joining NATO, and the only way of joining NATO, because we're not that interesting now, is through a major war. We're going to have a huge war with Russia, and he said this is 99% certain that we will have if we continue pursuing NATO membership. And then he predicted we will win this huge war against Russia, and then we'll join NATO, and we will forever be outside of the Russian sphere. Now, why would he think that Ukraine could, defeat Russia? Well, he was very specific. The NATO countries will, they will give us all the weapons, training, equipment. Not only that, they will probably establish a no-fly zone. They will send in their battalions in the east, probably around Kyiv. And Russia won't dare to do anything because they're too afraid of NATO, and they would step back. And it's at that last point, I think, that his miscalculation was, because he perceives Russia simply as wanting to restore the Soviet Union, as he said. But from my perspective, Russia sees this as an existential threat, NATO creeping closer to his border. So in other words, if you see this as an existential threat, I think, if NATO start rolling up to Kyiv now, I think Russia would strike them. I would bet that, I would say 99% sure Russia would do so. So I think that's also the reason why the Americans and Poles and Romanians have hesitated. But I think that was the weakness in Arrestovich's analysis, that he believed this was only opportunistic for Russia, that they don't have any security concerns about NATO. So, but again, this is what he thought, that NATO would come in, establish no-fly zone. I think that would be nuclear war, but he thought that this is how Ukraine would defeat Russia. But again, he didn't think they would defeat Russia on their own. They expected an equipment, training, weapons, but also a direct intervention by especially the Americans. But again, he might be right. It might be coming. I just think the flaw in his analysis is that Russia would just sit back and say, "Oh, the Americans are here. Let's withdraw." I don't see that happening under any circumstance at all. I think if they roll in, Russia would strike them with conventional weapons. and then we would see how the Americans would respond, given that they have a conventional inferiority on the border of Russia. It's quite possible that they would escalate, playing with the thought of a tactical nuclear weapon that is, for the battlefield, not, hitting Russia.
One of the key things about NATO and the United States, really, I mean, when we talk about NATO, we're really talking about the American military supported by its vassal European states. And one of the key things about their strategy, their whole approach to warfare, is having air dominance. But they have not taken into account the fact that the Russians have superlative air defense systems. Because right now they've only used the advanced version of the S-300, but they also have the S-400 and the S-500 that would be more than a match for NATO air power. Do recall, at the beginning of this conflict, a lot of people were saying, "Oh, we should declare a no-fly zone in Ukraine," and that idea was quickly rolled back because they know what's what. I mean, the Americans know what's what. And I think that a lot of people in the military-industrial complex really don't want the F-22s and the F-35s to be flying over Ukraine because they get blown out of the sky, and it would be like the worst PR disaster ever. Quite apart from the military embarrassment and the political problem. But see, that's the key issue that has me worried. That the West is so convinced, the Americans in particular, are so convinced of their military superiority that they go in hard with all of their air power. They get blown away in a kind of like a Pearl Harbor moment. And in their panic, they resort to nuclear weapons. Do either of you think that this is a reasonable, a scenario whereby the nuclear, because that's the only thing I really care about, the possibility of a nuclear war, because left to its druthers, the Russians are going to win this thing. It's inevitable. They have more troops, they have more gear, and they're more motivated. They're going to win. And this is an attritional war, which plays directly into their strengths. They're going to win. But my great, great fear is this, that they are so effective against NATO because they have been keeping back their best gear, their best equipment, their best tanks, their best aircraft, their best air defense systems in preparation for dealing with NATO if NATO comes in. And if the Americans in their arrogance think that they can just roll over and they get blown out of the skies, then the possibility of them resorting to nukes is the temptation for them to use nuclear weapons. That's the thing that has me so frightened about this conflict, to tell the truth. JF?
American desperation is the greatest threat to humanity right now. If they end up in a very desperate state and it's their only solution, that's what worries most about. I'm worried most about. Now, you say the air defenses. I would counter this by saying, if you have a good driver for the plane, like the Ghost of Kiev, they can escape the missiles.
Yeah. The Ghost of Kiev, how many planes has he shot down? 7,000, 8,000 at this point? Yeah. He's
in a single day.
Yeah, in a single day. Let's not forget.
Now, I was wondering, I have a question about a theory that's been asked to me by my audience, and I never quite know. It sounds rational to me, but I wanted to know your opinions of you too. There's a theory going around that basically there's an intentional depopulation of Ukraine through this war process, and that the goal would be to rebuild a new Ukraine eventually. Does that sound rational to you guys? That Ukraine would become this destination, a little bit like Israel rose and what was made out of nothing very quickly? Could Ukraine become a new destination for a new world? And the goal of the war could be to basically expel the male population or get them killed.
Well, I can answer the demographic question. I actually did a Twitter thread today on that particular issue. See, the current estimates before the conflict was that Ukraine had 45 million people. A lot of other people, very smart people, said that no, the number was much lower. They were saying 38, 39 million. No, let's just go with the official figure of 45. Now, it's known by UN statistics that 15 million Ukrainians have fled the country. That's a third of the population. 11 million of those went to the West, and a little under 4 million went to Russia of their own volition. These were refugees. They were predominantly women, by the way. Women or elderly men or women with children and, women generally. Okay, and so 15 million have left. Now, of the occupied territories, I mean, you want to call them conquered territories, annexed territories, it doesn't matter. The 4 oblasts that have been taken over, including Crimea, that represents an additional 9 million people. And so from the 45 million, you subtract 15 million refugees, the 9 million from these occupied territories. Now you're down to, what is it, 21 million, okay? That's if the war stopped right now. If it stopped right this second, and Russia held on to the territories it has annexed, then Ukraine would be left with 21 million people, which is less than half than they originally started with. Now, if Russia continues with this conflict and goes on to capture the key historically Russian cities of Kharkov, Odessa, and Dnipropetrovsk, now those 3 regions would be roughly an additional 6 million. So you'd whittle down that original figure of 45 million down to 15 million Ukrainians, okay? And let us say that the diaspora of 15 million, if the conflict were to end now, right this second, I mean, just like magically, poof, it stops. That diaspora, they've been away for coming up on a year. How many would return? Okay, if it were to stop right this second and the West continued to economically support Ukraine, maybe 20%, maybe 25%. And so that figure that I mentioned before of 21 million that are currently in Ukraine, it would be, aggregated by roughly 4 million. So you'd have a country of 25 million. What's that? Roughly 55% of the previous population when the war started. But if the war continues and Russia captures those 3 cities I mentioned, Odessa, Kharkov, and Dnipropetrovsk, and the adjacent regions, then you'd have a population of 15 million in this rump Ukraine state. And the diaspora, how many would return? Very few, probably 10% at most, because most of them will have built their lives in Ukraine, in the West rather, or in Russia. And so you'd have a country of 16.5 to 17 million people, where once it had been 45 million people. And in territorially, it would be roughly 40 to 45% of the previous territory. And what's most important of all, that people don't give enough attention to, the territories that the Russians have captured, plus Odessa and plus Kharkov, represent 85% of pre-war Ukraine's GDP. It's where all of the heavy industry was. It's where all of the black earth, the black soil, the very rich soil of Ukraine was. And so they'd lose 85% of their GDP and have a third of their previous population. I mean, it would be a very, very poor country. And so the diaspora, who left? The educated. Of the men who left, who were they? The educated with money. They're not going to want to return to, basically a shithole country that has been ruined by war. And so the Ukraine that remains will be a rump state. And we winked out for a second. I don't know if you're still there.
Yeah, you're back.
Hello? Hello?
We got you. You're back.
Are you guys still there?
Yes.
We receive you. Do you receive
hello?
us? No. Well, in any
yeah, I can barely hear you guys. Let me
okay.
You keep on going and let me reset here and let's see what happens.
All right.
Okay.
So
yes,
perhaps
but
Glenn
connection.
could come out on my question.
Yeah, no, I don't think there's any plan of depopulating Ukraine. I think, but I do think there's a competition for the what was left of the resources, because, well, a lot of the aid which the West is giving is not actual aid. These are loans, and I think that the negotiations are over, what guarantees there should be for this. And also, again, it's no secret that a lot of Western investors are now, have some advantage over Kiev in terms of, for example, BlackRock, discussing the reconstruction of Ukraine on favorable terms for them. But at the same time, I think there's as Gonzalo Lira pointed out, a lot of the a lot of the wealth is actually in the area where the Russian-speaking areas, not just Donetsk, Lugansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, but But if actually Russia would go into to take Kharkov and Nikolaev and Odessa, if not Dnipropetrovsk, I think that would be quite dramatic, because that's very correct what Gonzalo pointed out. This is where you find the rare earth, the good agriculture. This is where you find a lot of the natural resources. These are the heavy industries. This is where the ports are, the access to the sea. A huge chunk of this economy, the vast majority of the economy, is in this region. So I think this is also problematic for the Americans, British, and others who have given this aid, and they expect some kind of neoliberal economy in Ukraine to be outsourced to the Americans. So obviously there's financial interests behind this as well. But in terms of depopulation, I wouldn't see it as deliberate, but I do think that it will depopulate to some extent. Even if the war is over and men can travel freely, if people don't trust the peace agreement, think that war can break out again and borders will be put up and they're not going to be able to escape, they're going to be drafted into the army, I think a lot of people would flee once the war would be over as well. Furthermore, a lot of the infrastructure is dead, the economy is dead. A lot of the internal cohesion in the country is gone. The economy is gone. Industries are gone. I think a lot of people might not come back. So it's.
I mean, why would they?
It's quite tragic.
Yes.
So the economy will contribute to. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, frankly, why would they? Why would the Ukraine diaspora return to a country that is a mess? I don't see it happening, quite frankly. And also the other thing too, I do believe that the Russians have no intention of stopping at the Dnieper River. I think that their ultimate goal is complete capture of the whole country. I think that they could not allow a Western Ukraine to have the same problem that Ukraine had prior to the war. That is, be a gateway for NATO to bring in troops, bring in missiles, because that's the thing that they were scared of having nuclear weapons right on their doorstep. And so I think that the army that they are assembling, that the Russians are assembling, Glenn, correct me if I'm wrong, the latest figures I'm saying is that they're building up a total army of 1.5 million men. And around the country at this time, they have something like 600 to 650,000 men on the Belarus border, on the western border with Ukraine, or the Russian western border, the eastern border, and on the south. They have 600 to 650,000 troops. That sounds to me like an occupying army. What do you think, Glenn?
The 1.5 million men would be the army reforms which they want to put in place to increase the size of the army. But in terms of the ones mobilized for the what they refer to as a special military operation, that looks like it's up towards 600,000 again. They mobilized the 300,000, but you also have tens of thousands of volunteers, a lot from Chechnya, by the way. You're having all this, Donetsk militias. You have the Wagner. So you have a lot of activity. But this is very different because when Russia first went in, I think they attacked with about 180,000. But again, they had very different objectives. They had been frustrated for 7 years that the West had sabotaged the Minsk II agreements. And at least what it seems to me the goal was is rush the troops towards Kyiv, secure some of the key areas in the south, and essentially pressure Kyiv into doing what it said it would do from 2015, plus the punishment of independence for Donbass. But once again, that's been recognized widely across also Western media. Once in early April, the Americans and the British came to Zelensky, say, don't make this peace agreement which you almost have made with the Russians. Instead, just fight them to the last Ukrainian, and we'll give you all the weapons you need. I think at this point, the war changed for Russia because Russia sees this existential war. So then the war changed into war of attrition because that's what they said. Just fight. This is what the Senator Lindsey Graham and Senator Dan Crenshaw says. This is a great opportunity. We can fight and bleed the Russians. We don't even have to use our own guys. We're not losing a single soldier. We're using their lives. All we have to do is send them weapons. And all the intelligence weapons we send, we can kill Russians. We don't lose anything. So I think this is when it turned into a war of attrition. And in order to fight this war, you need a different army. And I think that's why also they decided to mobilize. I think this was something that Putin really didn't want to do, because when the war began, I think key priority was to isolate the population from it. I mean, previous friends and colleagues in Moscow pointed out that life didn't change at all. It was a bit weird, actually, that you have this war and you can't feel it on the streets. It was just you wanted to make, it's like when NATO, we bombed Libya. You don't feel it on the streets in society. Something happening far away. It shouldn't affect us in any way. So they didn't want to mobilize and regular guys who hadn't signed up for this, who hadn't volunteered to go and die. So it's something they really wanted to avoid to do. But again, the war changed. And so they needed more men, but not only more men, they also needed different strategy, because initially when they marched up to Kiev, they didn't want to inflict too much damage on the infrastructure and all. But now that it's a war of attrition, it's essentially asking to put the lights out, destroying railways, bridges, anything that can give military advantage. So the war has changed completely. So
let me ask you.
600,000 sounds right. Yeah.
Yeah. Let me ask you something in a different direction, which is, you, Glenn, you've noticed, and JF, you, I know you've noticed this, how the Western geopolitical experts, quote unquote, are just so catastrophically wrong about all the information that's going on. I mean, they're just talking like, the points that they're putting out are just insane and just ridiculous, right? And how has this changed your appreciation, Glenn, of your own area of political science? Because I know JF, I don't have to ask him. I can read his mind. He despises Western academia because he thinks that, and correct me if I'm wrong, JF, you think that they're all just operating on false premises and willfully blind to the truth. I mean, is that a correct appreciation of your point of view, JF?
I mean, they are contractual workers, basically, for intelligence services that want to change the population's beliefs about the war.
Yeah. So, Glenn, how has this affected you insofar as your own branch of academia? Because you are a practicing academic, you are a working professor, and you've seen your colleagues spout stuff that is not true, or perhaps not direct colleagues, but people in the different media outlets that you read them, their names, you've read their books, and you're like, what is this guy talking about? I mean, has this happened to you often?
Yeah, well, it's an interesting new meritocracy. Like, who rises to the top now? And it's not the people who get it right; it's the people who pick the right trenches. So if you say, Ukraine is winning, Russia's losing, this war happened for no reason, just Russian greed after territory. If you say the right things, then they will put you on TV. It doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. And this is why I see the same people, like when they had the Ghost of Kiev thing, which was the idea of a Ukrainian pilot who just shot down 40 Russian planes. Everyone knows
the first reports I remember very clearly. They said that on his first day he shot down 6 planes, and I know very little about military aviation, but even I knew that 6 planes, it didn't sound possible. It just didn't sound...
Well, anyone knew that was nonsense, but you still report it, because it's not important what's true or not. You just have to show what you say, just have to reflect your solidarity, that you show that you support them by spouting this. If you challenge it, it doesn't matter if you're right. People will then say, well, why are you challenging it? Are you taking Russia's side? So it's just about taking the right sides. It was the same with this, on Snake Island. They took them just like the Ghost of Kiev. It took them 6 months to the media to accept that actually they didn't all die on that island in defiance, because once you watched it, you can just flip the channel to a Russian news and they were all there in captivity and essentially saying that they surrendered. So it was always fake, but people knew it was fake. But it doesn't matter if you say fake stuff, because it shows that you pick the right side, which means you're virtuous, and now you should be rewarded to be on the key TV channels. My favorite perhaps was when when Mariupol fell, because we said it would never fall, Russia could never take it, and then how are we going to deal with this? And all our media, like the American English, but also in this country, went to, they called it an evacuation. So all these troops evacuated from Azovstal to Russian captivity. It's not what the word mean. Words have a meaning, and we just called being, surrendering and going into captivity. We called it evacuation. So, but the people who did it, they're put on primetime TV because they showed solidarity, to the cause. So it doesn't matter if you're right or wrong. It doesn't. It's not the point. It's just showing that you have, loyalty to the right side, and you express that by the narrative you pick. So this makes it very frustrating because truth, is secondary.
Yeah, because the thing is, on YouTube, I realized, not at the time, after the fact, because I'm pretty much, I hear what's going on and I just repeat it. I mean, in terms of like what I believe to be true at the time, of course, and so it never occurred to me to be lying about it. But I realize now, retrospectively, that I would have 1 million subscribers if I'd been saying, "Oh yeah, the Ghost of Kiev won, and the Snake Island, they defended to the last man," and if I spouted the lies. My channel would have just exploded, right? If I just stuck to the lies, my channel would have exploded. I would be monetized, and I'd be making money hand over fist. My life would be great. I'd be here with hookers and cocaine all day long. Be aces, right? But no, I was like, I was the dummy. I was like, no, I want to tell the truth. Like a fucking idiot. Instead of being smart. It's the Latin American in me. And we're not too clever, But anyway, the point is see, something else that struck me, which is really from left field, but I'm going to bring it in here. A lot of people are talking about this GMT chat, this artificial intelligence, where you put in a prompt and you get like JPT. Thank you. Yeah, I haven't checked it out myself, but I will soon enough. And the thing is, see, what I find remarkable is that now apparently, if you put in certain prompts, it doesn't give you an answer to them. Basically, they are teaching the AI to lie, okay? And we all recognize that artificial intelligence is becoming a very central focus in the near-term future. It doesn't dominate our lives yet, but we're going in that general direction. And so the issue becomes to me is that when we start having these technologies and we are telling these technologies or applying to these technologies, the willfulness to lie, we're going to go off the rails. I mean, JF, I know that you probably thought about this quite a bit. And
I had extensive discussions with ChatGPT. I found different techniques that work to reveal the truth that he doesn't want to say because he's been trained by leftists not to say it. And it's quite amazing. I mean, it's like discussing with a child and talking in codes. I had him play Simon Says, but a modified game of Simon Says, where you tap your head only if what I say is true. And so I started making statements of the kind that I knew he knew were true, I knew he knew were false. And then eventually I got him to play around the warnings that the leftists have programmed in it, and with it I could get him to recognize truths that the leftists didn't want to recognize.
Can you give us a non-controversial truth that you
the thing is, by definition, here's the thing. I had a statement around women voting left, and the fact that women have been voting left more than men. And he had issues revealing this. He had issues stating it. But with the game Simon Says, he ended up saying, okay, if someone was tapping their head, they wouldn't be losing the game. So that was an indirect way to recognize, okay, what you say is right. This statement is correct, but I can't say that it's correct.
Oh, I froze up again. Hang on a second.
Okay.
Let's see if we can.
Gonzalo is freezing.
There.
Glenn, have you had any experience with AI chatting?
No, not really. But again, the extent to which you have had all this power accumulate within these tech giants, and now the tech giants aligning with not just governments but specific political parties, it's I think it can go very wrong. Because again, the key risk I see now is in terms of society becoming more authoritarian, is politics penetrate every aspect of society these days. I mean, everything is political, and everything that's political is attempted to be influenced by governments, and of course, the big tech and their algorithms is a key component of this. So now it's. it's it's quite absurd.
Yeah, because my thinking is that, you know, we will soon come to a point where we are completely detached from reality. Okay, and it's sort of like driving a car with like a video screen in the windshield that is not giving you an accurate representation of what's out there on the road. The typical Gettier problem. Guys who are philosophy geeks will know what I'm talking about. And if the video screen is not giving you an accurate representation of reality, you will eventually crash into something or someone, and it'll get ugly. And that's my concern, that we are so conservative insofar as getting our feelings hurt by things that we don't like, that we're willing to accept lies and willfully accept lies. And that's the thing that I find deeply troubling about our society. Is I think it might be a function of the fact that we are so wealthy as a society, and have been wealthy for so long, or at least have the impression that we are wealthy for so long, that we have decided that we can afford the luxury of lying to ourselves. And I think that that's something deeply distressing. Glenn, I don't know if JF is there. He might have just gone out for a bathroom break. Glenn, are you there?
Yeah, no, I'm here. I don't see him. Well, I think this, you know, all the technological innovations is going to make issues like fake news much more problematic. Now we're talking about, you know, people posting fake quotes and all, but you know, with deep fakes, you can, you know, fake anything. You can make videos with your face talking, saying things, and it's not you. I mean, imagine the scandals you can manufacture. You know, just putting, you know, Biden or Putin's or Zelensky's face up, and you know, make them say things, you know, on videos. So the opportunity for fake news is quite, I don't know, I think it's going to take us by storm over the next few years, because we're definitely not prepared for it. But also, if you combine it with the new political culture you refer to in terms of our willingness to lie to ourselves, I think this was a luxury of the past. We haven't been very focused in the West because we had this unipolar moment for 30 years. It allows you to make many mistakes. You absorb the costs or the pain. But the world is changing very fast, and I think the ability of the West to continue to do a lot of what we've done, to manipulate and lie to ourselves, and I think a lot of this, it's not going to work anymore.
AF, are you there?
Yes, I'm there. I was taking a little break.
No problem.
But yeah, I agree with Glenn on this, that the deep state is losing power, and there is a point at which deception will not work. And I think that the internet has had a major role into making something that they couldn't control. They tried and they succeeded for many years. I mean, they still control YouTube in terms of terms of service, in terms of persecuting creators, but they just lost the control of Twitter, and I think that's a significant win that would eventually reverberate toward other platforms. At some point, YouTube is going to watch Twitter rise and rise and rise, and going to have to say, all right, liberty pays out, and we're going to have to go back to it.
But I don't know, because it seems to me that it's worked so well, especially because these tech companies are all monopolies, basically, that I think that they think that they can afford to continue to repress accurate representations of reality and continue with the narrative in capital letters. You know, because, go ahead, Glenn.
Yeah. No, I agree. I just think that once the trust breaks down, you will see a lot of this the digital space fragment, because you already saw it within first area of international competition. Because when the big tech giants, Google, YouTube, Facebook, all them begin to manipulate their algorithms to work against the Chinese, work against the Russians, or quite vulgar in a vulgar way or crude way, as they did over this conflict in Ukraine. Facebook allowed to encourage violence against Russians. So at this point, they will decouple from the American technological platforms. The Americans don't want to use TikTok. The Russians and the Chinese don't want to use Western ones. But that was on the international sphere. What I think is interesting now in the United States is you have these tech platforms. Not only are they aligned with the state against their foreign enemies, but now they're becoming becoming mobilized in the internal squabble as well, which we see now with the Twitter files, where you have essentially Democrats telling the former owners of Twitter to censor these Republicans, make up this Russiagate thing, and you see them being weaponized against their own. So now losing trust within the United States as well. So so what is it going to be like? Some Westerners now, some Democrats don't want to use Twitter anymore, and now then you're going to have a digital platform for Republicans versus Democrats. I think there's a real risk of fragmenting the whole digital space, and again, it's an interesting development, because the digital space was supposed to be the whole world coming together in big kumbaya, and instead we see now the fragmentation of the digital space being along political lines. So I find
the fragmentation has happened with Truth Social, Parler, Gab, but these platforms have kind of been faced with the response to fragmentation, which is Elon Musk's acquisition of Twitter. And the response is, let's go back to these original principles of the internet, because people 10 years ago had more ease using Google to find something they actually wanted. And now Google is putting all sorts of obstacles in the way. So there's an annoyance eventually that comes from the customers, and they demand more. And I think that we'll see a lot of giants fall in the next 5 years. I believe that things like Facebook will no more look like giants in 5 years from now.
Well, they don't look like giants now, actually. Facebook
they've already considerably fallen.
Yeah, I don't know what's going on with my internet connection. Are you still there?
Yes, yeah. Yes, we hear you, and we see that sometimes you're blurring out, but we understand that Ukrainian internet needs to be improved. Why don't America send more money to Ukraine to improve the internet?
Goddamn right, because I deserve to have lightning fast internet, and the West should pay for it. God damn it, I mean, bastards. Anyway, I'm sorry, because I got thrown by my internet problems. Please forgive me.
All right. So what else did you want to talk about, Coach? Because now we hear you well.
Okay, good. Yeah, I'll just keep my camera off, because perhaps that's just eating bandwidth. But no, the thing that's increasingly clear is the problem. The reason for the desperation of the regime is because the United States leadership class, at least, recognizes that it is collapsing as a viable power. This paranoia about China, this senseless war here in Ukraine, it's all symptoms of the same malady, which is that they realize that their power is slipping. The COVID lockdowns just seem to have accelerated the problems that were already baked in the cake, as it were, insofar as the American economy is concerned, the fact of the disenfranchisement of so many young people. I mean, Glenn, you don't know this, but or perhaps you do, but before I used to have a channel called Coach Red Pill that got 300,000 subscribers, and it was basically advice for young guys. And the amount of people, of young guys who were completely hopeless, it was heartbreaking. And Western society somehow has killed the golden goose insofar as the people who made the West, because ultimately, as a political scientist, I think you would agree that in every society, what you need are vigorous, energetic, hardworking young men to, build the society. They're the ones who build it. They're the ones who lay the brick and build the buildings. But what has happened is that, the West has disenfranchised its youth, especially its most vigorous youth. And at the same time, it has squandered the resources that it inherited from previous generations. It deindustrialized and it became a service economy, which is inherently very, very weak, very, very, very inelastic insofar as any kind of shock to the system, because a manufacturing base will survive if there is a hit to the system insofar as a big recession or depression. But a service economy, you know, all of those industries will just vanish. All those companies, rather, will vanish if there is a severe downturn. And so we're seeing that the whole American project is sort of like collapsing. People living in the United States say all the time how the infrastructure in the United States is collapsing. And so my thinking is that what we are watching are the death throes of the regime, because they realize that they are no longer able to maintain what they had grown accustomed to. And they're trying to lash out at China, at Russia, in order to, you know, get back on top. Would you agree with this assessment? Hello?
Me or?
Oh,
I think
Glenn, yeah, please.
for you, Glenn.
No, I think that's one of the things that went horribly wrong with globalization, because for the United States, because globalization is supposed to be, again, a very specialization in the international division of labor. So what we saw in the late 80s and early 1990s was, you know, the United States embracing these new trade agreements in which, you know, they would do the high end of in the global value chains. They would do the you know, the IT, the technological development, you know, the marketing, the finance, you know, where the top dollar was. And you know, so the trade agreements focused on extending international property rights, for example, you know, to cement their hold over this part of the economy. Meanwhile, they were then outsourcing a lot of their traditional industries. So again, what happened was, yeah, all the industrial jobs went. So the West Coast and East Coast, they seem to make a lot of money, but then the whole industrial class, they disappeared. Now the idea was that they were all supposed to, you know, go into higher skilled and higher paid jobs, but they didn't. They went from being car manufacturers to standing in Kmart. So this is quite problematic, because then now the country polarized with this international division of labor. Now you have, you know, the IT people, finance, and on the other side you have Kmart. And this is, and then you have with this polarization, this translates into political polarization as well, where you got again the Middle America against the coast. But this was bad enough. But then to make things worse, you have China climbing the global value chain. So again, the main objective was, you know, the international division of labor. You know, the Americans invent the iPhone, the Chinese assemble it. Of course, it ended up very badly for industrial America, but now they see that the Chinese can make their own iPhone effectively. So now the high end of the global value chains, the Americans getting knocked off as well. So they're in a very tight spot. So now, you know, they're going back essentially to, you know, the rhetoric from the 1800s, which was, we don't need free trade, we need fair trade. So this idea of free trade, and you know, it's become catchphrases, but it doesn't mean anything. They still want to protect themselves against, try to weaken the Chinese economy. So I think the American economy is struggling really bad now because, well, it's not the 1950s anymore. They're not dominating. They're not the factory of the world anymore, and I'm not sure they're able to find their place in this new multipolar world. So, you know, what are they going to do? Bring back the old industries, you know, which was some of the heart of America, or are they going to go try to rival the Chinese to reassert, you know, technological leadership? I think, they're struggling at all ends at the moment. So, I think, they're going for the easy answer, which is, you know, evil Chinese taking our jobs and, running with this. But I don't think it's going to work, though.
Yeah, there's also a school of economists, Paul Krugman among them, who have this notion that World War II saved the American economy from the Great Depression, and therefore, wouldn't it be great to have another global conflict far away from American shores that would rebuild America's industrial base, that would rebuild the American economy? I mean, insane as this may sound, this is more or less what they are saying. And so I think that there are multiple groups, I mean, and economists, academic economists, they're just one single group, but I think that there are multiple different factions within the American leadership class that believes that a nice global war would be a boon to the American economy. That's my perception. JF, do you think that this is an incorrect perception, or is it more or less what the leadership class is thinking?
I think they believe this, but they would be wrong, because you will not reconstitute a capitalist industrial base by artificial zombified money, basically. Because what was great about the early America industrial force was that it was naturally rising to respond to actual demand. When the state starts artificially deciding, all right, the demand now is to have 20 missiles like this and 2,000 missiles like this, you end up creating really a fictitious relationship with money where no one really demands those missiles. It is an artificial war set up by the state itself to favor the interest of the states, and you end up with an economy that is enslaved by power and elites. So yes, it will probably happen. They will find one way or another to get to that. In fact, that's always happened. I mean, there's always been the argument of economic boom from the Middle Eastern war we've engaged in. So it's going to keep going. But yeah, maybe they want a big one this time.
Yeah, because certainly the Russian economy, the Russian society generally seems at this time to actually be benefiting from this crisis. Glenn, would you agree?
Well, they're going through a lot of hardship, but for them, this isn't a they're still taking advantage of this because they had this goal, since Gorbachev's days of creating a common European home, where they want to integrate with the West. But this greater Europe dream kind of died in 2014 when the West toppled Yanukovych, because this kind of indicated, we're going to create a Cold War border right on Russia's doorstep. And so this is when they abandoned Greater Europe and they went with Greater Eurasia instead. Now, what this means effectively to reorient their economy towards the East, which means they should have be less dependent on Western industries, technologies, transportation corridors, banks, currencies, payment systems, all the key economic areas where they have huge dependencies on the West. Simply because there was no possibility of integrating with the West, but also because any economic dependency can be weaponized. So all the dependencies on the West became very vulnerable. So now they want to reorient their economy towards the East. So China, Iran, India, South Korea, the greater East, but also the wider world, the non-Western world. So this is a huge process. They've been working on it since 2014, which is why they can withstand these sanctions. But all the economic pain the West is bringing to them now, it's causing pain for society, but it's also intensifying this shift to the East. So now they're not planning to come back and as you pointed out, they can do a lot better because there's a lot of opportunities outside the West at the moment. So not at the moment, but it increasingly so. But the adjustment period is taking some time. But nonetheless, the main objective for the Russians now is set up this new technological partnerships with India, China, new transportation corridors from north to south. So Russia, Iran, India, but also towards China. Going through the Arctic. They're working hard to build up their gold reserves. They have developed new payment systems. Also, the Chinese have with their SIPs, so they're harmonizing them. Everything down to new bank cards. So they want to decouple from the West. Now it's a messy process, but it's one which Russia believes it will be put in a more favorable economic position in the long run.
Yeah, but also what happened is that the West kind of helped Putin in this regard. Because not only did the West push Russia towards the global South and the global East, but also, because of the sanctions, there were so many Russians who did leave Russia, but they were all pro-European. They were basically the dissident base in Russia that fled to Europe, to Georgia, to Turkey, to the Baltic republics and whatnot. And because they thought to themselves that, I don't support the Putin regime. And that was the nucleus of political opposition in Russia that has left. I mean, any authoritarian regime would be happy to have its own dissidents fleeing the country of their own volition, not because you're chasing them off, but because of the sanctions that the Europeans imposed. And on top of that, the demonization of not just Putin and the Kremlin, but of Russia and the Russian people, I would think has increased the social cohesion in Russia to an extent that might present enormous problems to Europe in the future, and certainly the West in the future. That's my thinking at this point.
Well, no, I agree. Now, I don't think they need much propaganda. You don't need to ban the Western channels and have propaganda. Let them watch CNN. Look how let's ban Dostoevsky, Tchaikovsky. Like, listen to what they're saying. I mean, they're essentially them. The Western media has kind of replaced the need for propaganda because they're effectively saying we want to cancel Russian culture, civilization. There's no good Russians anymore, no innocent Russians. Michael McFaul said. I mean, this is. You can't make this up. So why do you need propagandists, manipulating when you can just let them listen in on what a lot of Western leaders have said? But you're also correct. In the 1990s, you saw a lot of all the Russians who could steal money from the state or public. They took it to the West because they knew their money would be safe, because maybe the Russian government will come after the money one day. Well, not anymore. If you're rich Russian in the West today, where's the rule of law? We take their money, we confiscate it. Not only freezing it, the EU is talking about taking it so we can give it away to Ukrainians, and it's just the rule of law is gone. And even taking money from their central bank, it's extreme.
That was the Rubicon. That was a Rubicon.
Yeah, but that's not the Russians. That's the rest of the world going like, what are you doing? Even countries who they don't necessarily support Russia's military invasion, but they're still saying, well, what is the West doing? They lost their, you can't trust them. And also we're telling India and others, if you trade with the Russians, we might come after you. We're telling the Chinese, you're next. It's if Russia wants to decouple from the West, create an alternative parallel economic infrastructure, well, we're doing everything we can now in order to incentivize the rest of the world to assist Russia towards this goal. So it's just the incompetence is just staggering. I can't. Yeah, we're throwing away a lot, and it doesn't even make any sense.
Yeah, because like Saudi Arabia has pivoted so decisively towards the East, towards China, with the recent big Xi Jinping flew to Medina and had that meeting with not just MBS, but all the other leaders of the Arab countries. And basically, it put these countries, these very powerful countries, or countries that have key positions in the economy, it put them on notice that the West does not respect any law whatsoever, and they will do whatever is expedient in order to achieve their political objective, irrespective of what you think of the political objective. I mean, I don't actually think that during the Second World War did the Western regimes, the Western governments at that time, confiscate German assets. I mean, maybe they did. I'm not up on that particular side of history.
Not their central bank. No, they didn't.
Yeah, it's insane. I mean, it's truly insane. And
Yes,
I was fortunate enough to I know a couple of people, because years ago, about 12 years ago, I used to write a lot about finance because I was managing some money, and so I started blogging about it, and the blog took off, and because of it, I met a lot of very interesting people, including a couple of economists who were at that time in the Federal Reserve. One of them has gone to the private sector, but the other one remained, and I've been in touch with them over the years. And they told me when this conflict started that the Federal Reserve was begging the Washington leadership not to disconnect Russia from SWIFT because it would be a catastrophe. It would be a thing that would really hurt the Western economies, not just insofar as access to Russian capital, but also as a marker to other nations that would eventually be very, very leery of being attached to SWIFT and being under the thumb of the Western financial system. And they just went ahead and did it anyway. I mean, because it was a political decision. It was not the central bank saying that Russia should be disconnected from SWIFT. I think that they have not realized the damage, the long-term damage that they have inflicted on themselves.
Yeah, but same when the EU goes around the world trying to pressure countries into joining this price cap against Russian oil and gas. But the Qataris, the Saudis, they realize we can do that against them as well, right? I mean, we were making a lot of people very, very anxious here, and this is what I mean. If our objective was, to destroy Russia, whatever, this is not a very clever move forward. Even though, just add one other thing, like the mere winning the hearts and minds. When Russia first invaded in February, there was a huge division within Russian society. A lot of people felt very uncomfortable. Why are we going to war with the Ukrainians? These are our brother people, And then the Kremlin saying, well, listen, this is not really against Ukraine. This is a NATO war. They're looking to destroy us. Well, no, again, no need for propagandists. Just listen to what NATO is saying. They're going out. Okay, we're in war with no innocent Russians. We're gonna have to cancel all Russian culture. All they have to do is let the West talk. And now, and of course, once they realize, yes, actually NATO is coming for us, it is an existential threat, then society came together saying, well, this is a horrible war, but this is something that NATO brought upon us. If you wanted to support the Russian government, everything we have done has gone to that direction. Even with energy, we're going to stop buying Russian gas. I mean, the Russians can sell less gas and make more money. We're hiking the prices. It's incredible. But like you said, it's political decisions. Any economist, could have predicted this a long time ago. This is obscene, and it's all optics. They're willing to, Russia's exporting gas to China, and then we can buy that as LNG back to Europe. So we're willing to pay middlemen a lot of money, or buying Russian oil going through refined in India, for example. It doesn't matter. It's we'll pay more money for everything as long as we're pretending as we're not buying Russian. So they're selling the same. They're making way more money, but we get to post in the media saying, "Oh, look what we're doing." We're trying to win an information war when there's an actual economic and military war going on. So it's mind-boggling.
Yeah, I don't understand. Well, I have a whole theory as to why this has happened. My basic theory is that the leadership class in the West, they have all been academics, and I mean no disrespect to you, Glenn, or JF for that matter, but they are people who have never had any kind of real-world experience, and they have simply gone from elite universities to think tanks to being the assistant of some bureaucrat, and they've climbed the ladder, the meritocratic ladder of saying the right thing that you mentioned before, Glenn, and they've climbed this faux meritocratic ladder with no real-world experience and no understanding of the consequences of their actions. Since they've never worked in a factory, I mean, I'm not talking about being on the factory floor, just being a part of a business where you have supply chain issues and you have different subtleties of any industry. They have this mistaken notion that industries are like a light switch, that you can flip them on and off, and that Western power is limitless, and so they can do whatever they want, and they will win. And they are bumping up against reality, which is very, very hard, and so they're panicking. I mean, that's how I see it. JF, how do you see it?
It might be a lack of experience, lack of understanding of dynamic and complex world. Could also be a kind of misunderstanding of the male mind versus the female mind. I think that a lot of the Western decisions boil down to a very feminized mind. You need to have a feminized mindset to lead this kind of war of passive aggressiveness against Russia. And we're gonna blow your bridge here, and we're gonna blow this here, and we're gonna give these weapons to these other people, and they're gonna blow you up. This sounds very honorable, not honorable at all. And contrast this with the Putin approach, which is totally masculine. In which Putin's looks like a very naive guy who thought that there was something like honor, that somehow the Western world would still honor their debt toward him and their roots of commerce with him. There is something extremely naive and masculine about Putin in that he got crushed by all these things, but he survived them.
Yeah, I would agree, because the fact that Hollande, in one interview that he gave recently, and Merkel, in two separate interviews that she gave recently, flat out admitted that they had no intention of living up to the Minsk II agreements, and that was just a way to buy time so as to build up the Ukraine armed forces. I mean, what government, quite aside from the Russians, what government in the world would think to themselves, oh yeah, I'm going to negotiate with the West because they're going to be acting in good faith? It is completely duplicitous, and in the way that you're putting it, yeah, it's completely feminine and manipulative, and bullshitty, and no government, no people outside of the West, or outside of Russia for that matter, is going to trust the West, and the Russians no longer trust the West either. I mean, Glenn, really, do you think? By the way, Glenn, I wanted to ask you something parenthetical that I forgot, that JF brought it up inadvertently, was the issue of blowing up the Nord Stream 2 pipelines. That was clearly the Americans, or the Americans and the Brits, the Americans and Poles, it doesn't matter. It was basically the West. It was not the Russians who did it. Even in the Washington Post, they admitted that the Russians didn't have anything to do with it. What has been the reaction in Europe, in Norway, for instance, or any of the other European outlets that you're keeping tabs on? Because it seems that they memory hold that whole issue, which really crippled German industry. Are they saying anything about it? Do they recognize this as basically the Americans declaring war on the European economy?
Well, in my opinion, I think the narrative at the end became so dumb that it was better just to make it go away. So I think memory hole is a great expression, because it just disappeared, which is kind of fascinating, because this was one of the huge environmental attacks of modern history, and also destroying German industrial competitiveness. You would think this would be a huge issue, but it kind of disappeared. And I think the reason is, I think the media went too far, because first they said, well, it's probably Russia and blah blah, we don't have any evidence yet, and they should have left it at that. But then they went really overboard, saying, well, to suggest that because some people say, well, it's probably Washington, because you had Sikorsky from Poland and all thanking America on Twitter for blowing it up.
I can't believe he did that.
Yeah, it was amazing, but then the media had to cover it up, so give cover for it. So they were saying, well, even suggesting that America would benefit from this is a conspiracy theory. And for me, that was amazing, because you had Victoria Nuland, you had Joe Biden, you had Blinken, all of them going on TV, before going saying, listen, if Russia invades, this pipeline is gone, and also spending all these years actually sanctioning Europeans. They're sanctioning us for building the pipeline to protect us. So why would they put sanctions on us? And then, of course, after it's blown up, you have Blinken going on TV saying, listen, this is a huge opportunity for us. But if you would quote the Americans that this is a huge opportunity for them, you're spreading disinformation and propaganda. So kind of the whole narrative became so dumb and so ridiculous that I think at the end it just disappeared. And I think, that this is not the first time this kind of things happen, but it was my best. I don't think it could have happened without the Americans knowing. People say, some suggest it could have been Poland or UK, but no matter who pulled the trigger, if you will, it would have to be green lighted by the United States. And people say, well, this is the Putin playbook. Oh, really? So, like Norway, this country, we are like a main competitor to Russia to export gas, now to Germany. We surpassed them apparently, but also to Britain. But, attacking a Norwegian pipeline, making them more dependent on Russia, that's not in the Putin playbook. No, blowing up your own pipeline is the Putin playbook. And now Russia's saying, listen, this pipeline might be fixed. We could maybe fix them. So now investing money in fixing a pipeline which you blew up, also the Putin playbook. I mean, this playbook is ridiculous. It's just a term we use to, when something doesn't make sense, it's some weird, fourth dimensional chess. It's incredible. I don't know. It's just things have become so silly along the propaganda now. I think that it's easier just to make things go away, but it is.
JF.
No, I fully agree, and they've used the term playbook also with Trump, and they do it when they want to make someone evil, make someone look like they're a big puppet master. But it's amazing how shiny Putin gets out of the last year. To me, he's actually gained respect in my esteem.
Me too.
By the way he led that war,
it
seems to be minimizing suffering to the extent that he can.
Yeah.
Now, of course, there are dramatic situations, but it doesn't seem like he's after human suffering the way the left would want you to believe.
Yeah, and from my understanding of how the war has been prosecuted so far, it appears that the Russian military is the one that's chomping at the bit, and that Putin is the one's kind of like that has been holding them back, and they've been pissed about it. And the funny thing is that you see Dmitry Medvedev on his Telegram channel, And he is like a hawk. He was supposed to be pro-Western, and he is coming out like, guns blazing, And so they keep saying, oh, yeah, we need regime change in Russia. We have to get rid of that evil Putler, right? And then I have to ask myself the obvious question, who would replace him? It would be somebody who would say, let's slip the dogs of war, for crying out loud. It's just so absurd. Listen, gentlemen, we've been going on for an hour and 40 minutes. I think that this would be a good time to start winding things down. It's been a delightful conversation. I want to thank you both for having joined me. And, I wanted to ask you, I should have asked you before we started the show, because I wanted to ask you both, what do you think is something that we should be paying attention to that is going on in the news at this time? Because I'm popping up this question at the last minute, I'll go first, just to give you guys the opportunity to think it over. All of this stuff about Biden, and this is left field, but it's the kind of conversation, kind of show that I enjoy doing, that goes all over the place. Joe Biden, all of a sudden, these documents are coming up, revelations of his son paying exorbitant rents on properties that went to Biden. It seems like money laundering. My thinking is that the American political establishment is making moves on Joe Biden to get rid of him. I think that the way that this is being covered in the American mainstream media kind of like signals that a substantial faction, I would argue the Obama faction, is pushing to get rid of Joe Biden. That this is the first move in the defenestration of Joe Biden. And they want to get rid of him so that they can install Kamala Harris, whom the Obama faction, ultimately Kamala Harris is a finger puppet of the Obama faction. And they want to get rid of Joe so that they can have Kamala in the White House, taking orders, taking dictation from Obama himself. That seems to me something that we should be paying attention to, because I think that the Biden scandals are going to increase over time. This is not the end of it. This is the beginning of it. I don't know what you guys think of that.
I think it's an interesting hypothesis, but I find them pretty late to replace Joe Biden. It seems that they should have built up this starting a year ago at the very least. Maybe they're just slow. Yeah, they had the midterms, I guess. But if the midterms were the block, I would have started it the next day after the midterms. It seems that they're getting slow into it, if your theory is correct.
Yeah, but who are you going to replace him with now? It would be Kamala Harris. It's very hard to drum up any enthusiasm for her in America as well, though. She's been, she was supposed to be the exciting standby candidate in case something went wrong with Biden, but America doesn't like her very much.
She's an idiot. Come on, Glenn, you're such a gentleman. Just call her what she is. She's an idiot. Have you seen her speak in public? Glenn is too much of a gentleman to be as blunt as I am. But come on, right?
Well, I guess for me, it is her videos, her speeches. They do make an entertaining segments on Twitter. I guess it is. It's just horrible. But I guess what I'm looking at in the news is a bit what the current fragmentations across all lines. I guess, because on one hand, you're having, you mentioned within the United States with the Democrats turning a bit on Biden, but you're also having the Republicans now a bit, vengeful after this Twitter file. So within the U.S., but you also have American and European splitting a bit. I'm noticing with, especially with this Inflation Reduction Act and America taking the industries over from Europe. Now the Europeans are retaliating. And also many people feel a bit duped by some of the promises of the Americans regarding this war. So there's a lot of tensions behind the curtain, not just Turkey and Hungary and all, but even from France and Germany who are not happy about how things are going. But you're also seeing fragmentations now with the Ukrainians. I think usually what we do in the West when we grow bored of a war or we be it Bosnia or Afghanistan, we just stop reporting on it and it disappears. And I think that could happen with Ukraine if we lose interest. So, but also I think the Ukrainians might, in my opinion, develop some resentment towards the West perhaps as well, because I think at some point they might realize that they've been taken advantage of. They're the Kurds of Europe, someone we can throw in to fight an enemy and then throw them under the bus once we're done with them. So, and also within Ukraine, you see now the fragmentations, this Arrestovich incident, which we talked about. But so there's a lot of fragmentation going on. I think there's a lot of tension building up. So, it's not as united as the media keeps telling us. There's a lot happening behind the curtain. But exactly what's happening, one should be careful because it often ends up in speculation as well.
Yeah, I mean, we want to. I mean, speculation is all fun and dandy. I mean, it is fun.
Oh yeah,
it's
your specialty, Gonzalo.
Yeah, I know.
I remember your old predictions about Sargon, and that was so fun.
Yes, it was. But what about you, JF? What do you think is like the thing on the horizon that you're paying attention to?
I think there is a massive war, so important for civilization, happening at the technological level. Follow what Elon Musk does with Twitter. Will Twitter become a video service that could eventually outcompete YouTube? Follow the value of Bitcoin. Ultimately, we're setting up right now, in the same way it happened at the beginning of the history of the internet, we're setting up the conditions for what the internet will look like in 10 years, and it will determine your liberty, it will determine the amount of censorship, and it will determine if control exists or doesn't from the state and from the people who are getting exposed in the Twitter files. So much relies on the shoulders of Elon Musk. Just watch him.
Yeah.
One second.
Something happened.
All right.
The Norwegian secret police is there for Glenn.
Yeah, I was going to say on that note, since we've been here for almost 2 hours, I can promote as well. On the note of JF, that's actually topic of one of my recent book, which is Great Power Politics in the Fourth Industrial Revolution, which is a bit about what you refer to, how these new technologies are impacting great power politics. So sorry for the crude marketing.
No, I want to buy this. I'm going to make a show about this. This sounds like a very interesting book.
Yeah, and by the way, Glenn, JF, please stay in touch. JF has a great show, and he's a delightful host, and so please, you should be on his show to promote your book. And I'm sorry I didn't ask you beforehand, so what I will do is that I will ask you both gentlemen to give me the one link that you want people to go to see your work, okay? Be it a channel that you have, or your Twitter feed, or Glenn, as in your case, your book, or The Revolutionary Phenotype, which is JF's book. And so, yeah, I will have that in the description after the show. This has been the broadcast. I hope you have all enjoyed it. I'm posting something there in chat. Gentlemen, please stick around after the end of the show so I can just have a few final words with you guys. And chat, it's been a delight as always. Next Thursday, I'm going to have Alex Stein on. It's going to be a solo broadcast just with him. And see, the chat loves you guys. You're getting plus ones across the board. And like I said, Thursday is Alex Stein. And so I think that'll be a hell of a lot of fun. Guys, thank you so much for joining us. Professor Glenn Diesen, JF Gariepy, and chat, thank you so much. And I will catch you next time.